Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, and we're going to get into Dr. Horne's work. It's quite expansive, but I think really get into the Constitution. And as you were just saying, Dr. Horne discussed these things as contemporary problems. First, I was hoping you could introduce yourself, including what you'd like folks to know about your political development as it relates to your current historical investigations.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, in terms of my political development, I was born and raised in Jim Crow St. Louis, born in a Jim Crow hospital, Homer G. Phillips Hospital, now defunct. Working class background. My father was a Teamster, considered at that time to be the largest union in the capitalist world. Attended Jim Crow schools in St. Louis, but alas, the political climate was changing as I was coming to adolescence. And this is a critical and key point because it ties into some of my scholarship. That is to say, that because the United States was under pressure because of its horrific Jim Crow system at a time when it was an ideological conflict with the socialist camp and contestation for the favors of newly independent African and Caribbean countries, there was tremendous pressure to move away from Jim Crow. And so, therefore, I was admitted to certain schools that in an earlier epoch would not have done so, possibly, not because of merit or lack thereof, but mostly because of my African ancestry, for example. I went on to law school for a while at UC Berkeley, graduated actually, but I was very involved in politics then, the Angela Davis case, the Black Panthers, et cetera. This is the early 1970s. But the Counterrevolution, which also flagged that issue, because I tag that as a repetitive theme in the evolution of the so-called republic. Counter-revolution. Of course, we're going through a counter-revolution today as we speak, this time against the gains that helped to uplift people like myself. And so I abandoned the law for graduate school in history. And my first book, and the 40th anniversary of that first book on Du Bois and the Afro-American response to the Cold War, there will be a 40th anniversary edition in 2026. And the theme is what I've enunciated just a few minutes ago. That is to say, how the changing international climate helps to shape progressive change in this country. And I've extended that particular thesis with regard to slavery. For example, I've written a number of books on slavery, particularly the Haitian Revolution, which I argue, following C.L.R. James, ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse, including in the United States of America. Interestingly enough, I just submitted a manuscript this morning, another book on slavery, this time dealing with slavery and the slave trade and the roots of U.S. imperialism, but tackling the slave trade to the East. That is to say, the U.S. connection to the Egyptian slave trade, the slave trade flowing out of the Sudan, the attempted effort by demobilized Confederate soldiers to lead an invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia in the 1870s in order to reignite the external slave trade in that particular country, the slave trade and going across the Red Sea to West Asia, slave trade, slave markets in Jerusalem, Ottoman Turkey, and of course the role of Russia, because that's been a key factor in a number of my works. And in this work, it takes the form of Russia not only supplying Ethiopia, Abyssinia, with weapons to defeat the Italian invasion of the 1890s, but also publicly executing slave traders as early as 1816. And there's a whole backstory, needless to say, with regard to that, which would include, of course, an examination of Pushkin, a man of African ancestry, the father of the modern Russian language. So, in any event, that's just a snapshot of some of the things I've been involved in.
I'm particularly interested in how radical movements in the United States, which you've written a lot about, have thought about the Constitution. And I think different groups and individuals have said different things over time. It was particularly meaningful in my development what the Socialist Party of America had to say about the Constitution. I've also been introduced to passing things that W.E.B. Du Bois, Harry Haywood, C. Wright Mills have said about the Senate and how it entrenched the power of the South. I've also been aware of what Martin Luther King has and hasn't said at various points about the Constitution, the civil rights movement leaving the realm of constitutional rights. Then there's the Black Panther Party and their short Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. You've written about the Panthers recently. All that to say, in your look at national and international history and social movements, how has the U.S. Constitution appeared, and how have you worked in the U.S. Constitution?
I look at the U.S. Constitution in two ways. That is to say, even today, when I know much more about the seamy and grimy origins of the 18th century, these so-called bourgeois democratic upsurges, even today, if I were to go into court on behalf of a client, I would repeat the same liberal verbiage about our founding fathers would be turning over in their graves if they knew that this was happening. And thank goodness for the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, etc. You're obligated to do that on behalf of your client. I mean, you're trying to save your client from a sad fate. But speaking as a historian and also speaking as a scholar, I'm aware of the fact that since the time of Harry Haywood and Martin Luther King et al., there's been tremendous scholarship on the Constitution. Look at Michael Klarman's book, The Framers' Coup, for example. Michael Klarman, I think he's just retired from Harvard Law School. Joe Lepore's latest book on the Constitution, all the failed efforts to transform that document. In a review I wrote of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois's text, I quote him with regard to how, actually, it's the title of a chapter, if I'm not mistaken, in my book on Washington, D.C. slavery, where he talks about a kind of fetish with regard to the U.S. Constitution and its lunacy to let the dead hand of the past seek to govern us in the 21st century. And that, of course, brings me to the origins of the United States of America, which I've written quite a bit about. Part of the problem, and you see this in the Ken Burns series as well, these scholars, they oftentimes start their story in the 1750s, with the 7 Years' War. Of course, I start the story in 1453 with the Ottoman Turks, with the Muslims ousting a version of Christianity from what is now Constantinople, because and I've just started to work on another book about the Pacific Northwest and comparative colonialism with British Columbia, which of course has social democrats in power. And one of the differences between British Columbia in particular and those across the border is that there was extractive colonialism in British Columbia. That is to say, timber, fur, etc., which oftentimes mandated working with the indigenous. There was settler colonialism on this side of the border. And interestingly, I've been telling these U.S. leftists, they're using the phrase settler colonialism for historic Palestine, which is wholly appropriate. But I'm sure at some point some Israeli patriot is going to say, wait, you're anti-Semitic. Because why don't you use that descriptor for your own country? Which is true, because settler colonialism on this side of the country involved liquidation of the indigenous population, as happened in the Pacific Northwest, and in fact, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The Wall Street Journal when they were upbraiding some University of Washington professor recently for having a land acknowledgement in his syllabus. A letter writer wrote in, and of course he quoted Woody Guthrie. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Highlands, which totally is typical of the U.S. left. At some point, you have to move on. I mean, we don't have to denounce Woody Guthrie, but we have to realize that history has overtaken that particular idea of this land is your land. This land is the Native Americans' land. That should not be swept under the rug. Otherwise, you won't be able to understand settler colonialism. You won't be able to understand the class collaboration that inheres in settler colonialism. You won't be able to understand comparative history. You won't be able to understand that if these bourgeois democratic liberties were so important that it justifies mass enslavement and genocide, you must be presupposing that they form a template for applying to the rest of us, which is like saying that when apartheid was implanted in South Africa in 1948, and of course, look at my book, White Supremacy Confronted, that part of the purpose, per the Carnegie Corporation of New York, by the way, a consultant, was to uplift the population of European descent, particularly the working class, so they wouldn't align with the Africans. And so apartheid was not intended to be these benefits to the Europeans was not intended as a template for the Africans and the coloreds and the Indians. And likewise, the combat pay, to use the term that I've used as a metaphor, these liberties and benefits and largesse to the Europeans and European adjacent, because of course also ushered into the hallowed halls of whiteness were Lebanese Christians, Syrian Christians, etc. Ralph Nader being of Lebanese Christian descent, for example. Hoda, former host of Today Show, Jenna Bush's running mate, Egyptian Christian, roots in Africa. The spouse of Senator McCormick of Pennsylvania, Republican, Egyptian Christian origin. She's defined as white in this country. And so it wasn't intended to apply to the rest of it. That's why we've had so much trouble. That's why we've had to rely, to come back full circle, on international coalitions and international currents to have transformation, because it's not accidental, as historians like to say, that there is a political party, the Republican Party, which gets a majority of the settler descendant vote to this very day. According to the New York Times, 2/3 of the Republican Party approve of the piratical attack on Venezuela, which you should not see as accidental, for example. And as a matter of fact, people need to buckle their seatbelts, because I think for some time to come, there is going to be kind of class collaborationism in this country, which is going to be harmful to progressive advance, which is to say, I'm not saying it can't be overcome, because if it couldn't be overcome, I probably wouldn't be sitting here to this very day. But it gets, once again, these historical questions help to shape and govern political strategy. And so if you take it for granted that the class collaboration is not a factor, that the only reason these Euro-American settler descendants vote for the right is because the Democrats are not far enough to the left, which is the usual story from what I call the left-wing white nationalists, for example. Well, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. So to come back to the thread, the Constitution, perhaps in its day, that's the distinction you may want to make. Perhaps in its day, it could be seen as a step forward. But even there, I'm not so sure, because if you look at Enlightenment and so-called bourgeois democracy, which a lot of people have been writing about in a critical fashion. Matter of fact, David Bell of Princeton has a piece in the New York Review of Books, I think it's November, because I quote it in my forthcoming book on Hawaii, where he does this critique of Hume and Kant and all these other apostles of the Enlightenment, contrary to Bill Gates and Steven Pinker, for example. And Bell points out some of the racist things that they wrote, but then he dismisses it, of course, because he has to maintain his membership in the club. But to a certain degree, what happens with the U.S. project in particular is that you move from the divine right of kings to the divine right of men of European descent who can be defined as white and have property. And then with the Jacksonian era, it's broadened further because there is a possibility that the non-elite men of European descent can get property. I mean, you need to hold down the land that you're stealing from the Native Americans. And then they get these land grant universities, only themselves and their descendants can attend or even be employed. And it takes titanic struggles for some of us to barge our way in to these places. And then after we barge our way in, the left-wing white nationalists show up and say, oh, the system is so flexible. I mean, this is the way it was intended. It's all poppycock. No wonder we may be on the verge of fascism.
You've written about 1776, of course, as a counter-revolution.
That's right.
Could 1787, or the creation and shortly thereafter the ratification of the Constitution, could that fit into the same counter-revolutionary framework as 1776? Could we put those two together in some way?
Shortly. You may know that I also wrote about the Counterrevolution of 1836, which is on Texas slavery and Jim Crow and the roots of U.S. fascism. Given the reality that the secession from Mexico, spearheaded by Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston et al. On the basis of slavery, not only helping to rigidify slavery, but then moving into the lucrative business of the slave trade. The Lone Star flag could be found off the coast of Angola and Brazil. And so you can see the whole history of Texas as an extended counter-revolutionary period, with a few exceptions. And you may recall the Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was a sort of a liberal in Texas. Even in the 1930s, you had certain communists and socialists in Texas. But what happens is that many of our friends on the left, they take the exceptions and turn them into the rule. As I said, they give the system too much credit. I mean, we struggle and get shot and organize globally to force change. And then they come along and say, oh, the system is flexible, as opposed to saying it's a titanic and gargantuan struggle to force these kinds of concessions. In a few days, the third part of the trilogy will be out, the Counterrevolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin. There are many people in Hawaii today who see the archipelago as an occupied nation, for example. So in other words, the whole extended period from the coup of 1893 up to 2025 can be seen with peaks and valleys as one extended period of counter-revolution. And so sure, you can see 1787 as being part of the counter-revolutionary process because, as I suggested, the elites, the slave owners who were the moving force of 1776, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, they had enough sense to try to broaden the base if they're going to take on the British Empire. And even with broadening the base, and of course, being forced to have the Bill of Rights, which, as you know, were not part of the original Constitution, which broadens the base further. With all that, they're barely able to resist the British Empire. And round two, as you know, comes into the War of 1812, where the Republic barely escapes. As I talk about in my Washington, D.C. book, how the Africans aligned with the invading redcoats, sacking the capital, sending James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets. Many of them flee on British boats to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. One of the points I've also been stressing, it's the flip side of the earlier point about class collaboration inhering in settler colonialism. You may want to reference at this point the settlements on the West Bank if you want to understand not only settler colonialism, but class collaboration, for example. As I said, at some point, the Israelis are really going to unload on these people in the United States for using the descriptor class settler colonialism to describe what they're doing, but somehow not describing what's happened in North America. Because wait a minute. I mean, especially the way they toss around this term anti-Semitism, they've probably already done it, but it's definitely with Mamdani, I'm sure it's going to become a salient factor going forward in 2026, 2027. But the flip side, of course, is class struggle, which has been exemplified by the class of the unpaid sector of the working class, which is a matter of survival. Speaking of Black people, had to engage in class struggle, up to and including trying to overthrow the state and collaborating with the British, as I just said, about the War of 1812. And then you have these people who come along, and I was just reading an obituary in the New York Times. I can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote this typical book about identity politics and how there needs to be more of a stress on class. And I was thinking, does he know about the Red Scare? I mean, does he know about the Taft-Hartley Act? Does he know about the attack on West Coast Longshore? Does he know about the history of the last 75 years in the United States of America, which involved a formidable attack on class-based organizations, which has led to the weakening of unions? Does he know about Leonard Woodcock, the former leader of the United Auto Workers, who became Jimmy Carter's ambassador to China at the time relations were opened and helped to shepherd the industrial plant of the Midwest across the Pacific? No more sterling example of class collaboration can be found. So part of the problem with a lot of these people on the left, they don't understand. They come up with all these theories, but they don't understand history. They don't understand the history of the country that they're involved in, which is why they're doomed to irrelevance. And part of this whole discourse of identity politics, which really gets under my skin, obviously, is that, okay, fine. So they weakened working class organizations, and Black people being heavily working class, it's weakened our life chances. So then we try to build these so-called race-based or ancestral-based organizations, and they don't like those. That's identity politics. So they want us to be defenseless. I mean, come on, man. Or they don't it's like Senator Sanders, he doesn't specify. I think it was in November 7th, 2024, New York Times, although check the date. He blames the Democrats' loss on identity politics. But what is he talking? I mean, is he talking about the Black liberation movement? He's talking about the trans issue? I mean, he's certainly not talking about Israel, a state based on an exclusivist ethno-religious identity where rights and benefits are doled out on the basis of identity, because he used to live in Israel. No wonder we're on the verge of fascism.
From my perspective, there's been a missing discussion around the undemocratic political system that we have. There are a lot of other things that get discussed, but the undemocratic constitution isn't discussed, which is why it always interests me when I find these little voices or these little snippets of folks who do say something.
Well, I'm thinking that brings to mind, and you can interrupt me if it's off course, Nicole Hannah-Jones and her 1619 Project, which was excoriated and denounced by establishment historians, by many social democrats, et cetera, because she had the gumption to suggest that a revolt led by slave owners may have had something to do with slavery. And it ignited a furious response from the White House, the 1776 Commission. Although I think ultimately, needless to say, it's had a positive impact. If you look at the latest book by Joseph Ellis, whose scholarship has been funded by the Ford Foundation, Pulitzer Prize winner, in his latest book on the founding, and of course he's written book after book on the founding, he examines, I think he calls it the Great Contradiction or something like that, where he tries to explore how and why it is, along with this alleged expansion of democratic rights with 1776, that it did not necessarily include the indigenous or the Africans. In fact, you could make an argument, it's like looking at the Second Amendment to the Constitution, that part of this constitutional framework was designed to keep the indigenous and the Africans in line, for example, by having militias that are well armed to suppress their revolts, for example. My understanding is that the new Ken Burns series, ideologically, it represents an advance of what might have come out in 1976, for example. Because scholarship advances. I mean, that's even in a country like the United States, scholarship advances. Sometimes there's a lag in terms of people not reading the scholarship. That's one of the reasons why I have this program on the Pacifica Station of Los Angeles, KPFK, where every Saturday I tend to interview scholars. One of the takeaways is positive, which is that given what I know about the state of scholarship, and even though I've even issued some pointed criticisms of some of my fellow scholars during our conversation, it's not going to be easy to turn this country all the way to the right, not least because you have these scholars who are really, I guess it's tenure, which they're trying to get rid of, who are really doing significant work. Now, part of the problem, to go back to the critique, is I once wrote a piece where I suggested that the scholars were like the jury in the Rodney King case. Remember a few decades ago, black motorist Rodney King was beaten and was captured on tape and went to trial. And rather than play the tape all at once, his lawyers, they would play a little snippet and say, "You see any problem here, jury?" No. Play another snippet. And I think that's part of the problem with scholarship is that the scholars, they're looking at snippets of history, which can't be fine. I mean, a person like myself, I couldn't have written a synthesis on the 16th century, which I did, and another synthesis on the 17th century, which I did, without all of this scholarship that scholars have written about different aspects of those two critical centuries, particularly about Martin Luther, about Henry VIII, about Mary Queen of Scots, about the first Queen Elizabeth, about 1588, and how London barely escapes being overthrown by Spain, about the difference between Spanish invading what is now Cuba and setting up a system where as early as the 1500s, you have armed Africans and militias, which is something that's, shall we say, not necessarily normative on this side of the Florida Straits, for example. I mean, I couldn't have written all that without all of this pre-existing, what we call secondary literature, for example. So that's part of the contradiction. On the one hand, I think that the scholars have done, generally speaking, have done a useful job in looking at their corner that they're studying, but we don't have enough syntheses, for example. People trying to pull it all together into an overarching narrative. And I understand because if you do, hey, this right wing, they play for keeps.
How do or how can these really interesting ideas, and I think whether it be related to the Constitution, other historical events, so many things, how do those things get out of the academy? I'm tempted to say
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
your work appears in lots of different places. You go on the Black Agenda Report. You write about
Mm-hmm.
Du Bois and the Nation. You
Mm-hmm.
put out a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work. I am confident in saying you're an example of a scholar in the academy who brings these ideas to channels that more people can interact with than just say an academic journal. Is that one way to do it? Is it more of an organic process, a mass movement developing and intellectuals going to that and bringing their ideas?
Well, you hit the nail on the head with your latter comment. Obviously, we need a mass movement. I mean, uh, keep in mind that you began to have a change in the historiography of slavery precisely with the rise of the Black freedom struggle in the 1950s and 1960s, the anti Jim Crow movement with Kenneth Stamp's book, Peculiar Institution. And then he ensconces himself in Berkeley, and which has a movement of various sorts, which facilitates the arrival of Lawrence Litwack and Larry Levine, for example, who then in turn train graduate students, then spread out to other institutions and then get tenure, for example. But it all starts with the movement, for example. And that's one of the problems we have today is that the right wing has been quite effective in destabilizing movements, destabilizing left wing forces. But I would like to say, on a more positive note, that if you look at recent events, the Mondani election in New York, the election of the Social Democrat Katie Wilson in Seattle, the election in Miami of Eileen Higgins, defeating decades of Cuban American mafia rule with those of Cuban heritage, some at least, without proper documentation, being shipped to Guantanamo, for example. The election of a trade union organizer, Brandon Johnson, in the city of Chicago, who, among other things, has called in recent weeks for a United Nations investigation of the dispatching of National Guard troops. And of course, that let's hope that that was a factor in the Supreme Court pulling back on legitimacy for that deployment. One of the few victories we've been able to wring out of that conservative court, which then induces Mr. Trump to follow the law. At least that's what I read in the newspaper in terms of withdrawing National Guard's forces from Chicago, Los Angeles, etc. I would like to think that we're moving in a positive direction. I would like to think that with this latest piratical attack, speaking of what's happening in Venezuela, that will bring more people to the streets, more people to the movement. Certainly, it's going to lead to a shakeup globally. And now I return to my original point. The leaders of Denmark have suggested that if Mr. Trump tries to seize Greenland, that means the end of NATO. And we cannot rule out Mr. Trump's trying to seize Greenland. So that could mean the end of NATO, for example. It could lead to more anti US imperialist manifestations on the old continent, just like I think you're going to see it in the Americas as well, with the kidnapping of Maduro. So I remain optimistic, but at the same time, as a person who's lived for a number of decades and, as I said, was born into Jim Crow, uh, I don't tend to have illusions about uh, what it takes to advance on the progressive front in this country.
I'd like to pose at least two more questions to you. One, to bring us into the international realm, and then I thought we
Mm,
could close by thinking about the significance of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence this year. But To bring us into other countries, and particularly Latin America, I spent some time in Mexico myself and was actually there when the current president was elected, and found it particularly interesting, this recent constitutional reform that allows for the direct election of Supreme Court justices. And Mexico has come up in various points in your work. In fact, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned your book, The Counterrevolution of 1836, and you talk about
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
interest that folks like Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Catherine
Mm-hmm.
Dunham had. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, in that work as well, a very interesting note that Martin Luther King III met with
Mm-hmm.
Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the former president of
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. They were
Mm-hmm.
honoring Vicente Guerrero, who abolished
Mm-hmm.
slavery in most of the country. So, all that to say, where does Mexico and then Latin America in general fit into your work and your interests?
Well, first of all, something that I've been thinking about a lot since January 3rd, because you have all these people commenting, understandably, on Latin America, but what it really betrays is they don't know that much about Latin America, and particularly our southern neighbor, um, which has a long history of influencing this side of the border, which has a long history of accepting exiles, particularly Black American exiles, some of whom you mentioned. I would also mention Elizabeth Catlett, the sculptor who married Francisco Mora and lived in Mexico for a good deal of her adult life. Father of Langston Hughes, Jack Johnson comes up in my book, Black and Brown, because he sought exile. Speaking of the late heavyweight boxing champion, he sought exile in Mexico City. And I'm very concerned about the statements that Mr. Trump has made about President Sheinbaum, because apparently on his hit list is not only Greenland and Panama and Colombia, but also Mexico as well. And that's quite concerning uh, for various reasons, because it's taking place in the context of the renegotiation of NAFTA slash USMCA. And obviously, Mr. Trump is trying to gain leverage because, in the wider context, if you look at the national security strategy enunciated just a few days ago, where, from the point of view of the US ruling class, rather wisely, Trump moves away from a frontal confrontation with Russia and China, because that's a fool's errand, and instead says there's going to be concentration on this hemisphere, which then brings us to Mexico, it brings us to Venezuela. And I trust and I hope that people understand the politics of the United States and understand the politics of MAGA, for example, the anti interventionist wing and the neocon wing and the pro interventionist wing, and how Mr. Trump with Venezuela, I think, has tried to carve out a middle path between these wings. That is to say, bombing, but not occupation, at least not thus far. Unlike Afghanistan, Iraq, for example, hit and run, smash and grab, for example. And as I've been warning in various podcasts, I think the next step is forcing down airplanes. Recall that they tried that with Evo Morales when he was leaving Europe. They thought that Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, was on his plane. If I were leaders of certain countries, which I will not name because I don't want to jinx anybody, I wouldn't make any foreign travels for until the dust settles, until we figure out what's going on. And it's obvious that those sorts of guerrilla tactics, if you like, are going to be the stock and trade of U.S. imperialism, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, for example. And obviously, our friends in Congress have to try to defund Navy SEALs, defund Delta Force. I trust and I hope that President Sheinbaum has adequate security. because I think that sometimes there's a lag. I was on Black Radio just yesterday, and we were talking about Venezuela, and so people were calling in talking about the Trilateral Commission, for example. And I was reminding them, well, that was decades ago, and now Mr. Trump is going after Europe. I mean, it's not like partnering with Europe to exploit the world. They're going after Europe. Look at the national security strategy. So I think there's sometimes a lag between how events are unfolding. Perhaps people are not keeping up and what they are thinking. And so I trust that that's not afflicting President Sheinbaum and her security team. I'll mention some of the names, not the obvious one, of course, is President Diaz-Canel in Cuba. I would even say President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who got upbraided in the Oval Office. The leaders of the Sahel states, Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, and the leaders of Mali and Niger, for example. But the good news is, in that grim scenario, is that I think my own untutored opinion, not having attended West Point and only sporadically looked at military science, that it might be easier to defend against smash and grab than invasion and occupation. That's my own untutored opinion. We shall see.
I wanted to end with this question around the 250th declaration, excuse me, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This idea of universal and equal rights contained in it is, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., a check that still has to be cashed. It's an idea that's put out there and has so clearly not been accomplished. And I think about Langston Hughes' great poem as well, this idea of let America be America again, in which he says basically, let it be something that it has yet to be, and then something that poor people, Indians, Black people, me, he says, have to make. How do you think leftists should relate to the 250th anniversary? How should we frame that event?
It's going to be a tidal wave, a tsunami of propaganda. And many of our liberal friends will be swept along in the slipstream, for example. But if I could wave a magic wand, I would say, uh, let's have an examination of those who were clearly left out of the bounty. Obviously, there's a split in the indigenous community with regard to the declaration. Let's examine that, for example. Something I've been thinking about a lot, and might be the subject of a next book, which is, why didn't Quebec become the 14th colony, joining the 13, for example? That could be illustrative. Florida was ruled by the British from 1763 to 1783. Why didn't Florida join the 13 colonies, for example? With regard to what comes out of 1776, and this is something I have written about in my book on Zimbabwe, why is it that in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in November 1965, when you had the unilateral Declaration of Independence, the revolt against London, why did the settlers say that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776, for example? I spent most of 2025 in British Columbia. Their line is that Canada's the greatest country in the world. I wasn't I thought people in the United States, they were the only people who have that line, and that everybody wants to come to Canada. I was there, so I couldn't complain. But why is it? And of course, they have a very romantic and naive view of republicanism, small r, which I'm going to tackle in this book. But why is it that you have single payer healthcare in Canada, which did not revolt against British rule, but not in the so-called Revolutionary Republic? Oh, and then a footnote with regard to historians, they not only need to be comparing the Republic to Canada, in terms of comparative analysis, they need to compare it to Australia, for example. And Canadians, instead of making these comparisons to the United States, they need to be comparing their history to that of Australia as well, and New Zealand as well. They're much more similar than those who revolted against British rule. But I don't expect what I've just articulated in the past few minutes to come up with this tidal wave and tsunami of propaganda. But I might be surprised. I just mentioned Joseph Ellis's book, for example. I mentioned the Ken Burns piece, which I think are steps forward if you take the long view, going back 50 years, for example. So we'll see. Maybe we'll all be pleasantly surprised.
I would be all for a pleasant surprise. And I think your discussion of comparative projects is very important. I imagine that people come to critique what's going on here in the United States in all kinds of ways. And I think one way can be to compare US political institutions, the outcomes of our political institutions, the systems we have, healthcare, so on and so forth, with what goes on in other countries. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for joining us. I really appreciate having you on, and I really encourage folks to dive into your work, and I'll share some of that in the show notes. And I, again, just appreciate all of the knowledge that you have and the ways in which you make it easily available to folks by putting it out there in all different ways.